Good morning again to all of you. I'd like to continue the exploration of the Satipatthana Sutta with you this morning, exploring this morning the third foundation of mindfulness. I think this sutta is pretty brilliant in its instructions of how to look at our experience and to grow insight that also supports us being more wise in how we see our experience and how we relate to the world. So we started with the first foundation, which is being with the body, and this body has these sense gates. There's 6 of them, the mind being one of them. And when the sense gates meet the sense objects, there's contact. And instantaneously there is Vedana. There's a hit that we get of pleasant, unpleasant, or neither pleasant or unpleasant, the sense of neutral, that we can train the mind to see. This is a discerning, pointing of experience where we can see the subtlety of how we're constructed, how the mind is constructed. And when that contact happens and there's Vedana, if there's pleasant Vedana, we tend to lean in a direction of greed if we're not aware of it. If it's unpleasant Vedana, we tend to lean in a direction of aversion or trying to stamp it out or sense of ill will or annihilation. And if it's neither pleasant or unpleasant, we tend to go into a space of delusion or a kind of vagueness or fast forwarding through life, being, kind of not touched. It doesn't have enough charge to it to get our attention. So we miss a big part of our lives because that's what's happening mostly. It's kind of like the stars and the constellations. If you see the stars as single episodes of what arises and passes away in the mind, it's hard to see that there's actually a Big Dipper up there that has a shape. And, we can train the mind to see more than the episodic activity of the mind, which is what we're going to be exploring this morning. Being mindful of mind. So as humans, we have this capacity to know, to turn awareness on itself. We can turn awareness on itself and see what's there through this practice. We can be aware of awareness. To know what's here, what's arising in the mind, and also to know how we're relating to it. We can know what's arising and know how we're relating to it. This kind of knowing is a little distinct, which I think really speaks to the brilliance of these teachings. Because to know anger, knowing of anger, the awareness of anger is not angry. The awareness of fear is not frightened. And this is the subtle shift that we're actually doing, this Aikido move again, this subtle shift that allows us to see what's here differently. We're shifting our habits of mind from being the object to knowing the object, just knowing. And I say just knowing because I know it's not that simple to just know because we have these ways that we become it. But this practice, this sutta, the Satipatthana, it supports a certain balance and clarity of mind, of how we view what's arising. And it's also, this practice, especially in the third foundation, is looking at what's arising without interference. Can I see what's here without interfering, as if I could make it better? You know, can I leave it alone and see what's here? Can I not attach so much meaning to it? So the sutta in the third foundation talks about the ordinary mind states, that we can become aware of ordinary mind states. And it reads like this. A piece of the sutta says, he knows, she knows, they know. They know a lustful mind to be lustful, and a mind without lust to be without lust. They know an angry mind to be angry, and a mind without anger to be without anger. They know a deluded mind to be deluded, and a mind without delusion to be without delusion. And they know a contracted mind to be contracted, and a distracted mind to be distracted. So what's beautiful about this to me is it's not just knowing the objects of mind, knowing lust, knowing anger, knowing greed, knowing aversion, knowing delusion. It's not just knowing that, it's also knowing its absence. When it's no longer there, becoming acquainted with that territory. Because regardless of what arises in your mind, it has holes in it. It's not solid, fixed, and forever. The mind is constantly changing. And we can see that through this third foundation. Very intentionally, we can see what arises and when it's no longer there, and to become acquainted with that territory and then see what happens next. See where it leads. We're looking at the moods of the mind in this foundation. It's almost as if what arises and then passes away has a fragrance to it. And we can see, oh, wow, what happens next? Where does this lead? Does it lead to more suffering, or does it lead to more freedom? What's happening in the body? Is it contracted? Is it open? We're seeing, we're knowing. We're knowing what's happening. We're knowing the mood of it, and we're knowing what happens next. So the practice includes a noting of experience, a knowing of experience, being touched by it, naming it, and then seeing what happens. Now, in the sutta talks about ordinary mind states and higher mind states, but I'm going to focus more on the ordinary mind states for now. Because in the realm of ordinary mind states, one of the things we notice is we view the mind states as individual entities. It feels personal. It's like I, me, mine, my anger, my depression, my fear. It feels really close in. And when we feel depressed, worried, and angry, it colors, it creates a certain atmosphere in the mind that then influences how we see what arises next. We can see this, and when we slow it down. So this idea of I, me, and mine is a real big one, because it's where we solidify. It's where we become a solid self, as opposed to a non-self, which is not um, tightly woven into such a strong sense of self that you can't see the holes in in our construction. Christina Feldman, a beautiful teacher in IMS and also uh, very much a part of the Gaia House up in Devon. She was doing a teaching and she referenced a German philosopher but didn't give the name. But I had to write down what um, he said, and it goes like this. And this is looking at the mind attaching itself strongly to a self. They write, I have come to the frightening conclusion that I am the decisive element. It is my personal approach that creates the climate. It is my daily mood that makes the weather. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or humor, hurt or heal. In all situations, it is my response that determines whether a crisis is escalated or de-escalated, and a person humanized or dehumanized. So we can see the power of I in this sense. And in the Buddha, the Dhammapada might say it differently from a Buddhist perspective. That might read, all experiences is preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind. With our thoughts, we make the world, and all that we are arises with our thoughts. So the practice, especially in the third foundation, is one of opening our awareness and tracking the movement of mind. We're tracking the movement of mind. And it's like kicking back and checking out the big screen. But it's not so simple because the mind gets fixated on the objects that arise. We identify with it. We identify with it. We get snagged. We zoom in on the experience and contract around it. We're not doing this on purpose. This is kind of just our habit of mind, you know. So there's a word that's used to kind of talk about this in the teachings, and it's called papancha. And papancha is the production of thinking flavored by an underlying mood, attitude, and belief that distorts experience. One way to think about papancha, I like to talk about it, is when you go to the amusement park and you're in the cotton candy line. And the cotton candy starts off with this cone, and then, they wrap it around all this pink gooey stuff. And it goes around and around and around, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, And then they hand you this sugary, gooey thing that looks more interesting than it tastes. And it's a big mess, actually. And you got to eat it fast, otherwise it starts to kind of dissolve into its core thing, which is pure sugar, And we eat it, right? So, that's what papancha is like. We start with a cone, and then we add layers and layers and layers of meaning to it. We just move, you cut your finger and it's like, ouch, But then we add, oh my God, I'm going to die. And oh, the blood's going to get all into the food. And oh my goodness, And then before we know it, we've got the big cotton candy, right? Another way I think about papancha is like a mannequin. You see a mannequin, it's just this little structure. But then they add clothes to it. All these layers of clothes to it, And the clothes have different, outfits. Like I dress the mannequin very differently than you, but these layers of meaning get added to the structure of just the mannequin, of just the cone. And this is what Papancha does. It adds additional layers to a core thing that's just arisen. So there's about 5 strands of Papancha that happens that kind of captures us and holds us, you know, imprisoned. There's aversion-based Papancha, where we're in a place of judging and shaming and blaming and isolating and perfecting. We're looking at what's wrong. And then there's craving-based Papancha, sense of discontent and insufficiency and looking at what I don't have or what I need or what's missing and what I need more of. There's fear and anxiety Papancha, perfecting, rehearsing. I'm going to rehearse the perfect interview in my group when I go. It's rooted in a difficulty of facing the unknown, so we get anxious and create some sense of false refuge to get us through. There's view-based Papancha. Sometimes we see this in our political fixations of what's right and what's wrong and how the world needs to be shaped to accommodate my belief system. And it should, by the way. I'm still working on that one. And there's mana-based Papancha. And this is the Papancha where there's the seat of the self. There's a narrative we have about being better, worse, on top of, or same as, where we compare ourselves to other people. And that can be just kind of a running, all of these Papanchas could be like running systems in the like elevator music in the back of our mind. A Buddhist view is what we dwell upon frequently becomes the shape of our mind, and the shape of our mind becomes the shape of our world. It becomes the shape of I am. And this whole thing represents a certain loop that we can see through the third foundation. We can see this concoction of the cone and the cotton candy added to it. We can actually see that creation as it morphs in the mind and be curious about its arising and its passing away, and whether we're feeding it or not with more layers. We can see that in the mind. So just think for a moment, given those 5 strands of Papancha, what's your frequent flyer? We all tend to have one, whether it's aversion or craving or fear and anxiety, strong view, strong selfing. Papancha plays a role in maintaining a self. And we'll see a lot more Papancha as the self starts to soften in the process, in our practice. We get scared. What's going to happen? Who am I? The Papancha zooms us in, usually. It has us fixated on an object of mind that arises. And the challenge is to zoom out and see, Anytime we zoom in and lock in, something's being left out of the experience. Something's being left out of the knowing. So one practice or one way to think about it is zooming out. And Bhante Gunanatara, beautiful teacher in our tradition who wrote the book on mindfulness in plain English, he writes about this quality of awareness that's more spacious than our fixation. He says it this way. He says, awareness happens just before you start thinking. A flash second just before you focus your eye and your mind on the thing. Just before you objectify it, clamp down on it, and segregate it from the rest of existence. Just before your mind says, oh, barking dog. Those few seconds just before you conceptualize it as a thing is also mindfulness. This soft, unfocused awareness contains a very deep knowing that is lost as soon as you focus your mind and objectify the object into a dog. Once the mind perceives, mindfulness is quickly passed over. And this practice teaches us to prolong that moment of awareness so that you can see it and be with it right where it is. So mindfulness is not just looking at the object that arises, is looking at the whole spectrum. What's happening before the object arises? What's happening when it subsides, when there's cessation there, passes away? Winnie the Pooh says it this way. Well, said Pooh, what I like best, and then he had to stop and think, because although eating honey was very good, there was a moment just before you began to eat it, which was better than when you were, but he didn't know what to call it. Mindfulness. I want to just say a little bit more about this fading away part, this kind of passing away, this territory we can open to a bit more, because we know when we know these objects, we can lock in there easily. But this fading away is a real rich area, because I think it's the place where we can actually exhale a bit more and relax into experience and open to what's occurring in my experience in the absence of an object. We want to become curious about the spaces in between the thing that's arising, the dog that's barking. So when the object begins to subside, a lot of times the hindrances, the defilements as they're referenced, the areas of greed, aversion, and delusion that really captures and holds us. When that starts to subside, we're kind of in those in-between moments. We can become acquainted with space itself, with a sense of emptiness, sense of maybe spaciousness, opening. That can be terrifying for some of us. I think we have an addiction to intensity. We're allergic to freedom. Some of us are. So it's an invitation to kind of, when we look at what's here and when it's no longer here, which is what the sutta is inviting us to do, to know the object and to know when it's no longer there, then It's the knowing when it's no longer their part that we can tune into a bit more. We often fast forward over this experience. So let's do a little experiment here. Let me invite you to tighten your fist really, really tight. Hold it really, really, really tight. And feel on the inside, tightness is like this. You can feel the tightness. And notice when you can no longer hold this grip. Okay, some of us can live our lives this way. So, let me change that instruction and invite you to just soften, soften the fist. But don't just soften it, feel the release as you let it go. Feel all of the release as you're loosening this grip. Notice how it's not just in the hands, it moves all the way up through the arms. Really taking your time here. Could even be a numbing effect. That's what I'm feeling in my hand. We get to a place of opening the hand. I'm noticing one of my fingers doesn't want to cooperate. And now it did. I'm feeling the release now. Letting go is like this. Release is like this. So this third foundation is inviting us to know the tightness as well as the release. Know the fixation as well as the subsiding. To not have preferences about it. So here's another read that touches on that by Wallace Stevens. He wrote a book called 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. And it says, I do not know which to prefer, the beauty of inflections or the beauty of innuendos, the blackbird whistling or just after. The sound and the cessation of sound. So mindfulness here in this third foundation is inviting us to know what's arising and know what's passing away and know what happens next. Sense of tracking without interference. To know if what's happening leads to more suffering or more release. That second part of the sutta is speaking to the higher mind states. And what I've found personally is these higher mind states become more discernible in longer retreats because there's a stilling that makes these higher mind states available to us. But they can also come in blips and pieces. The sutta reads, they know a great mind to be a great mind and a narrow mind to be a narrow mind. They know a surpassable mind to be a surpassable mind and an unsurpassable mind to be unsurpassable. They know a concentrated mind to be concentrated and an unconcentrated mind to be unconcentrated. And they know a liberated mind to be liberated, and an unliberated mind to be unliberated. So we know freedom, and we also know when it's not there. And higher mind states relate to the mind as fluid objects. The relationship to what arises is seen as fluid objects with certain qualities and characteristics. On a long retreat that I was on, I had the mind state of aversion come up so strongly, and then it subsided, and I was able to feel the space that the aversion had occupied in the body. In the absence of the fixation of the object, I was able to feel the territory it had occupied. In other words, I felt soreness and achiness where the thought had lived in the body. You know? So it was no longer the object I was with. It was this sense of thawing out that I was starting to experience, the soreness. And it was a beautiful, what I was feeling was the release from the tightness that aversion had created, had been such a place in my body. So the idea of non-resistance is a real important part of what we're talking about here. Can we be with the experience with a sense of flow and ease so that we can see this subtle level of noticing what's happening, what's arising, what's passing away, and what's next? There's a poem by Judith Roque called Credo that I think speaks to this beautifully. She writes, I believe in the cave paintings of Lescaut, the beauty of the clavicle, the journey of the salmon. I believe in all the gods, I just don't like some of them. I believe the war is always against the imagination, is recurring, repetitive, and relentless. I believe in fairies, elves, angels, and bodhisattvas, Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. I believe Raven invented the earth, and so did Coyote. In archaeology lies the clue. The threshold is nominous, and the way in is the way out. I believe in the alphabets, all of them, and the stories seeping from between their letters. I believe in dance as prayer, that the heartbeat invented rhythm and chant, or is it the other way around? I believe in the wisdom of the body. I believe that art saves lives, and loves make lives worth living, or is that the other way around? So what I like about this is that it's not really locked into one way of belief, but this lightness or dance and openness that can really support us knowing more deeply. So there's an awareness involved in this this practice, this third foundation of the knowing mind, knowing what's happening, knowing what's here. And this third foundation brings us into ethical alignment with our precepts, because when we can see how the mind is working, we can align to a sense of non-harming, not taking what is not offered, false speech. I mean, we can really see how the mind is in alignment with that or not. Sayadaw U Tejaniya, one of our teachers, says one thing you need to remember and understand is that you cannot leave the mind alone. It needs to be watched constantly. If you do not look after your garden, it will overgrow with weeds. If you do not watch your mind, defilements will grow and multiply. But here's the line I really like. He says, the mind does not belong to you, but you are responsible for it. You are responsible for it. So we can't control what arises and passes away, but we're responsible for it. Responsible for what we do with that, our relationship to that. So as we move into a movement with all of this, what I most want you to remember is to forget everything I just said. All of it. Forget everything I just said. And perhaps just focus on something very simple. The Dhammapada says it this way. It says, there is no fire like lust, no grip like anger, and no net like delusion. And in the movement, what we can begin to see is that there is the basic experiences of pulling in, pushing away, and running around in circles. So it could be an interesting experiment in the movement just to see, the element of pulling away, pushing away, or just kind of being lost in a cycle. Knowing what's here, what's arising in the body, knowing its cessation, knowing when it's no longer there, seeing what's next, resting in the in-between places, knowing that territory, knowing when you're not fixated, contracted. And the inquiry is what's happening? Can I allow it to be here? And can I know where it leads?